Hi, this is Bob Murphy, and you're listening to the Libertarian Christian Podcast.
Welcome to the show that gets Christians thinking about faith and politics. Get ready to challenge the status quo, expand your imagination, and tackle controversy head on. Let's stand together at the intersection of faith and freedom. It's time for the Libertarian Christian Podcast.
Welcome to the Libertarian Christian Podcast, a project of the Libertarian Christian Institute. I'm Nick Gosling.
And I'm Doug Stewart.
And we're joined today by Jeffrey Tucker, the Director of Content at the Foundation for Economic Education. Jeffrey is here to talk to us today about Pope Francis's recent comments attacking libertarianism. In late April, the Pope, in an address to the Pontifical Academy of Social Sciences, stated that libertarians are radically selfish and deny the common good. He also claimed that they are antisocial and think that relationships limit freedom. He said that libertarians believe only individuals can give value and decide good and evil, and that libertarianism is invading culture, schools, and the universities. Lastly, he stated that libertarianism promises a beautiful life, but that this promise is deceptive. Now, Jeffrey, you actually have a book titled A Beautiful Anarchy, which was recently released in Spanish.
Right.
So it's...
Well, it was a weird experience for me because I first saw this, public announcement that the Pope had criticized libertarianism. And, as a Catholic, you learn to be a little suspicious of these kinds of claims when they're first made by the media. It was very common under the pontificate of John Paul II and Benedict XVI that you would hear the New York Times, the Pope blasts capitalism. And then you go to the actual statement, and it turns out to be a much more nuanced understanding and never quite what the press said it was. So when I heard about this statement, I was desperate to look for the original statement, and I found it over at the Vatican site for the Pontifical Council for the Social Sciences, I guess it's called, which is something of I don't know what to say about that organization. I mean, it's something of a slush fund for academics that the church wants to pretend to be associated with. It's I've known several people on it, and it's one of those classic cases of high prestige, low influence. But anyway, so the Pope is speaking there, and sure enough, he goes right after libertarianism. And as I began to read the statement, I started getting a kind of a creepy feeling because there's several portions of it that actually seemed strangely familiar to me, and it seemed to be directed against my book in particular. And I thought, well, I had to blink a little bit. I thought, well, am I actually being personally criticized by the Pope? And I can't prove it, but I asked the publisher, and he said, well, obviously, what other prominent libertarian and with a Spanish language book out, and obviously the Pope and all of his translators and all of his speechwriters are Spanish. Uses this kind of language. It's almost at every point it seems to be directed against your new book, which is a big seller in Spain and over Latin America, called A Beautiful Anarchy. So I thought, oh, this is great. I was delighted by it, of course, and I immediately changed the cover photo on my Facebook page to the trial of Galileo. Which is absurd. Although if I had gotten the Galileo treatment, I think I would have been very happy, because Galileo, once he was proved a heretic, was given a villa in Rome and allowed to live out his days writing books and reading, with a team of researchers. So it wouldn't have been so bad. But it was amazing to see. I don't know. Is this the first papal statement that directly names libertarianism? As an enemy of the faith? I think it might be. So it is rather significant for Catholics.
Yeah, and what we've seen with Pope Francis, I mean, I'm a Protestant. Doug is broadly a Protestant, so we're certainly not experts on the Catholic Church and Catholic theology. But what we've seen from Pope Francis has been a very kind of precise attack on free market economics and various things in a way that's, to my understanding, relatively unprecedented. So this does seem to kind of be a major focus of his. It
is weird. I mean, he's definitely almost obsessed with issues of political economy, which is an area that's obviously outside of his competence. I don't entirely unwelcome Francis, though, I must tell you. In other areas of church governance, he has actually been, and I hope I'm using this term accurately, a liberalizing force in some ancient aspects of church law that really desperately need to be addressed for pastoral reasons. He's been a little bit of a radical, and I have appreciated some of his suggested changes. I got to tell you, change in the Catholic Church is very difficult. You've got a body of law. And maybe this is a good thing, but there's a body of law called canon law, and the church has its own court system, and all Catholics are obliged to comply with the law. And some of it is just like any body of law, filled with such amazing cruft from the past that it makes life very, very difficult. And Francis has been somewhat courageous and sort of taking issue with some of this, particularly as it pertains divorce and remarriage and some other hot button issues. But on issues of political economy, I mean, look, he's just wedded to something like a socialist paradigm, and not just casually. This isn't just a kind of a dopey socialist talking. I mean, he seems, I think you're right, really focused on what he thinks is the problem with economic liberalism, and seems to be, attacking it all the time. And I think to this extent, I mean, first of all, if he's departing with tradition of the post-conciliar popes, for certain. And now, I made an argument in my piece that he's really departing from a long tradition that dates from the late medieval period up to Second Vatican Council. I should be clear, though, that the Catholic Church so-called teaching on this matter it's a very mixed bag. So you have some very good stuff from the libertarian point of view, and then you have some very bad stuff from the libertarian point of view. I mean, so you can tell the story with two different, conflicting plot lines. What bugged me most about the statement was not so much that he has his own views. That's fine. Every pope, has a certain political bias. I mean, Benedict was something like a conservative communitarian. You could regard John Paul II as something like a neoliberal and so on. But what bothered me is this sort of seeming anathema, if you know what that term means, and church history. He anathematized libertarianism, as if it's not permitted to believe it, like there's something inherently immoral, and that outlook is a real departure for the church.
One of the things that you pointed out in your piece, I mean, it seems like the way the Pope describes his understanding of libertarianism is a very caricatured understanding. It's probably not how hardly anyone listening to this show, or you or me or Doug or anyone else here would understand libertarianism. It basically seemed like what he did was he kind of took a form of atheistic objectivism and put the worst possible spin on it and said this is libertarianism, and then he denounces that. Well, yeah, I mean, I would denounce that as well. But that's not my understanding of.
Yeah, and I don't even think it would apply to his caricatures. It doesn't even apply to objectivism even. I mean, it's not as if Ayn Rand denied the importance of cooperating with others, or was some sort of, aggressive, elitist. I guess you could call her an ethical individualist, but, denying that community matters, I don't think she would have ever done that. I mean, I think what you have here is just really just a pure cartoon version of all the opponents of liberalism, from the 17th or 18th centuries all the way up to present. I mean, it's always been the case that every time the liberal tradition asserts the rights of individuals, or free speech or freedom of religion or something like that, the opponents of this perspective start screaming, well, so you just want individuals to run around believing, saying whatever they want, doing whatever they want. I mean, this perspective is at war with our community understanding of our culture, the nation, the destiny of our people, blah blah blah. I mean, this line of attack has been going on for many, many centuries, as generally targeting the liberal tradition, the liberal tradition that the church once championed, I should add. So. Against the opponents of Catholicism. So, I find this very disturbing. Let me also just add a slight footnote here on terminology, which I think is really important. When the Pope attacks libertarianism, I mean, there's still a sense in which the sort of vernacular use of that term is associated with a certain degree of political exoticism. It's a neologism, in the post-war period. It's got a lot of syllables. People don't always know what it means. It pertains to a lot of issues and ideas, and so for that reason, because it doesn't really have a firm cultural association with it, people associate it with something just generally bad or dangerous. Not always, but a lot of the time. So, for example, if the Pope had attacked, instead of libertarianism, had attacked the liberal tradition, of which libertarianism is certainly a part, if not synonymous, his attack would not have been nearly as effective. So I think that was by design, really.
This article that the Pope, denounces libertarianism, as many things do, came across my news feed in Facebook, and I read the article. I don't even remember the source, but it was a little agonizing to read because all I read was a description of a philosophy that I identify with, but a description that just totally just went off. And, that kind of thing kind of makes my blood boil a little bit, because I get kind of tired of hearing it. And, you've heard and you've espoused your own, way of putting libertarianism. And I know that, every libertarian has their own, sort of nuanced way of explaining it. Why do you think that this is a very, I would say, rampant misunderstanding of libertarians? I mean, we do emphasize the individual in one sense. On the other, it just seems like nobody understands what we mean.
Yeah, I know. Well, and again, there's nothing new about this. This has been going on for centuries. It's been the burden of the liberal tradition since the Scottish Enlightenment and before, to explain to people that the interests of the individual and the interests of the community are not inconsistent, but rather share a mutual benefit and an aspiration for the good of all. The good of one is not inconsistent with the good of all. Okay, that is a difficult idea. It just is. There's a reason why liberalism emerged so late in human history, because it's hard to understand, and I think it's very easy for people to fall back into a kind of individualist antinomianism, which means a kind of a lawless, autonomous individualism, as versus a kind of coercive collectivism. I think people tend to toggle between the two. Well, the correct libertarian understanding of the relationship between the two is essentially we need each other. The collective absolutely needs the individual to function well, and the individual absolutely needs the collective in order to realize his or her aspirations in life. So they go together. And the key thing that the liberal tradition argues is that the benefit of both the individual and the community are maximized under conditions of human freedom, when you don't have a centrally imposed plan from the top. And look, folks, this is just a really difficult message, and we can never rest in saying it. I mean, if people got it the first time, we would have been able to shut up in the 18th century at some point. But for some reason, every generation needs to hear it all over again. I mean, this is what you guys do. This is what I do every single day. I write a different version of the same message. The interest of the individual and the interest of the community are not inconsistent. They're mutually reinforcing.
That makes it sound even more worthwhile. It's not a cheap idea. It's really valuable to grasp and understand it, because it's enriching and it's a rewarding way of looking at the world.
Well, that's right, and it's an intellectual adventure to discover, all the ways in which that's true. And that's why I say I never get tired of seeing it and saying it. That's all I do. I mean, I got intrigued with that idea in college, and I've just never stopped being fascinated with all the ways in which it's true. So yeah, it does get frustrating when some influential, powerful person stands up in a microphone and says a bunch of caricatured nonsense about what we believe, and well, what it does is inspires us to, double down again and explain these things. I mean, the burden of what I tried to do in my article was just to say to the Pope, look, the Church has many statements in its past that are completely consistent with what the libertarian tradition believes. So don't go around anathematizing us. You should actually think more carefully about what the libertarian strains, more than a strain, in Catholic history actually has to say.
Well, and along those lines, Jeffrey, in Catholic thought, and correct me if I'm wrong, the Pope can only speak authoritatively on matters of theology, right? So when he's making a statement about economics or political economy, that really shouldn't carry any more weight for a Catholic than something they read in the New York Times, like a Paul Krugman article. Is that fair to say?
Well, you can have a lot of respect for the guy and that sort of thing, but no, it doesn't. As we say, it doesn't bind your conscience. You're not bound to believe it just because the Pope says this. This was, in a very fascinating way, a question put to the test in the late 19th century First Vatican Council, which hardly anybody talks about, but it was a really important moment. You probably know it as the council that finally codified and entrenched, the doctrine of papal infallibility. But Catholic history is complicated. What actually happened to that council is fascinating. This very interesting pope named Pope Pius IX, who began his life and his pontificate as a kind of a liberal in the classical sense. I mean, really a genuine good guy. But it was a period in the 1880s when the church started losing the papal states. There was a lot of rebellion. There was a rise of democracy, the rise of socialism, and even the communist agitation. And there were some terror groups, alive in Italy. And his Secretary of State, where somebody was shot out of the window of the Vatican, and the Pope, had to go running for his life down the street, and he came back loaded for bear, and he dispensed with his old liberalism and decided it was time for a massive crackdown to stop the rise of liberalism, democracy, socialism, whatever you want to call it. And so he called a church council, and this is a very tedious and long church council, and nobody knew what the heck they were doing there, particularly not the American bishops. Rainy, cold, everybody was sick. And it just went on forever. And also it didn't help that everything was in Latin, right? So but anyway, as we approached the end of the council, it became obvious to everybody what it is that Pius IX was wanting. He wanted the church to make a declaration of infallibility, and he wanted it to pertain to himself on doctrine, on morals, and, if you can believe it, on politics. He was looking for the papacy itself to be declared politically infallible. That was what Pius IX wanted. And of course, when you ask for something like this, you're not asking for it just for yourself and your successors. You're asking for it retroactively throughout the whole of Christian history. So, which is just unbelievably dangerous and ridiculous claim. The idea that popes have always been politically infallible. I mean, please. It's a strange credulity enough to claim it on doctrine and morals, but for politics. So all the opponents of political infallibility had to do is dredge up a history of unbelievable bloodshed and horror in the history of Catholic Christianity to show that this can't possibly be right. Papal infallibility was rejected at the First Vatican Council, and the fallback position, which was in fact a humiliation to Pope Pius IX, was that the Church's infallibility was narrowly restricted to matters of doctrine and matters of morality, which had been the widespread understanding for a very long time in history. So it was actually Vatican I is widely seen as a council that gave birth to the idea of papal infallibility, but a deeper look shows that it was in fact the council that absolutely and finally repudiated political infallibility, and thereby the power of the papacy to wield the sword in a violent way to coerce people against their will with the power of the state. So that's what was rejected. In other words, Vatican I really ended up, despite the Pope's intention, embracing liberalism as we understand that concept today. So I hope that wasn't too much history. I find it absolutely fascinating. Anyway, you're right. The Pope's infallibility is narrowly restricted. He can only bind your conscience on matters of doctrine, whether Jesus was both God and man, and whether what goes on at consecration, how many sacraments there are, and so on, and matters of morality, whether you should kill, steal, that sort of thing. But on politics, yeah, these guys have their opinions. It doesn't matter either way for believers.
One of the things that I've appreciated most in my probably about decade of becoming and maintaining my strong libertarian stance has been some of your work, some of the ways that you look at the world and you describe things in such a beautiful, you're very fascinated by what you experience from day to day, and you write about it, and it gives a, I don't even know how to put it, it gives a visual to a libertarian world, or a world where people are free to make what they want, to buy what they want, to go to places that they would like to go to. Every time I have trouble with my gas can, I think of you, because you wrote about, how horrible the state has made our lives in that area. Or, the other day we're remodeling our bathroom, and, I drilled in my shower head, and I thought of you. I was like, well, if it weren't for Jeffrey Tucker, my life would be worse off. So,
that's great. I'm so glad. I love it so much when I can write something that actually penetrates into a person's daily life. And I look for ways to do that, So that's why I write about all these weird topics, because I really do. I mean, I'm personally flattered by the idea that, when people step into the shower in the morning, they're saying, thank God for Jeffrey Tucker.
Well, and along those lines, Jeffrey, I actually saw you speak in person probably about 8 years ago or so. It was at a Mises Circle event, and I remember you talked. I think this was right after Bourbon for Breakfast came out, and you talked quite a bit about shower heads, and I still remember that to this day. So yes, your impact is wide ranging.
I can't, and I don't know. I look for regular mundane things to write about, and I remember when this happened to me slightly, because when I first sort of got interested in the subject of libertarianism, I spent, it seems like a year is probably a month, how time gets mixed up when you're young, but trying to figure out, am I conservative or am I a libertarian? That, I don't know, does everybody go through that? I couldn't decide. And so I read every kind of book, and libertarianism was always treated as this kind of abstraction that was stemming from a series of syllogisms or assertions about positive and negative rights and all the rest of it, And that's sort of where I had left things in my life for the longest time, until at some point I realized something really important, that liberty wasn't just some abstraction, some intellectual puzzle. it really was about how we live our lives, and that liberty is really all around us. Our freedom to act and to choose is something that's really baked into the human experience. And if you look for signs of that around you, you can actually find ways to be amazed at all the mundane aspects of life. And once I kind of personally discovered that, life has never stopped being absolutely fascinating. In other words, I knit together in my own mind real-time human experience with high philosophy, and I saw that there was a bridge between the two, and ever since then I just can't stop crossing that bridge back and forth all the time. So that's how my brain works, and what keeps me thinking and writing every day.
I'm glad you enjoy it, because I know many of your readers do. I'm sure you hear that feedback a lot. It's one of those things where you may be underappreciated in that way. I mean, we all appreciate it, but don't ever stop doing that. I mean, you just wrote about fidget spinners. Yeah. My wife and I were sitting in bed last night, both each reading it on our phones, and we're just like, wow. I mean, sorry, this is a bad pun. That's a different spin on this. But it's
I started it off. I do this to myself sometimes, because I always figure I'm going to come up with something in the end that's a little bit outlandish, because I know this from experience. I don't intend it that way, but I set that up as a writing project and a thinking project for me. But, it's like, here is a very, very popular thing with a gigantic market all over the world. It's swept boardrooms and public school classrooms. Teachers are banning the thing. I wanted to know what is behind this thing and why is it so interesting? What if I tried to speculate about that? And it sounds dumb, but I set out to really think about it. And then I think of writing as like a hunt. I was like on a hunt to try to find the key. By the time I dug myself out from under that article, I had actually persuaded myself. So that article has a sardonic maybe feel to it, because I deliberately wrote it and with a Hegelian sensibility, But actually, I got to tell you, I found myself persuaded by my own rhetoric by the end, and I was like, my goodness, in times such as ours, we desperately need, things we can hold individually between our fingers and drive from inaction to action through the use of our own human volition and choice, as a way of affirming the very essence of what makes us human. And I realized this was true. And okay, you could say, well, that's not true about the fidget spinner. Well, maybe it's not true, but I think I tried to make my best case, and I got to tell you, I believe it.
Well, and even if it's not true what you said, and by the way, listeners, go and read the article. We'll post it on our show notes page. Even if it's not true specifically about fidget spinners, your observation that it is our impulse to have somewhere where we can control and have autonomy is where we can matter. Definitely true. Yeah, and it's where we can matter. I mean, my kids are into it right now, and so you put a practical spin. Well, my son ordered one, and then my daughters, they want one, so we ordered one yesterday, and then I read your article, and I'm like, oh well, this is great.
That is so funny.
Yeah.
I love trends like this, and this one of the fun aspects of human life is, it never stops evolving and changing. That's just the nature of the structure of the world. And these funny kid trends, they seem to be moving on a 6 to 9 month schedule. So. Yeah. And I was really unhappy about this, because I had written about bottle flipping, a very compelling article about bottle flipping, and then I guess I just wasn't paying attention. And so the edible slime trend, blew right by me, and I never even had an article about the topic. And sure enough, just when edible slime is on its way out, I became aware of it, and I was made aware that the new thing was fidget spinning. And so I thought, I was just determined to write, the theoretical treatise on this one, since I felt a sense of disgrace that I had never even one time ventured to write about edible slime at all. So By the way, this desire to sort of chronicle the life of our times through the lens of liberty. I got this. I have to credit my mentor, Murray Rothbard. He was this way. He would wake up with just this wild passion to want to document what the heck was happening all around him and why it mattered. And he was that way, and I caught that bug from him.
I have a Catholic friend who taught me something that resonates with me, and is the phrase "matter matters." And what you just said sort of reminded me of that, because what we do every day with our hands, with things like fidget spinners and edible slime and things like that, or mowing our yard, or taking a shower, or just a way of looking at the world in a very tangible, practical way, it does take the libertarianism and it puts it on the ground, and it makes it something that is within our grasp, within our comprehension, instead of having to be the kind of people that are all cerebral and thinking about it in sort of an academic, aspect to it. And obviously,
you're so right.
You said that you go back and forth, thinking about it in both kinds of ways. In your article, you do sort of venture your own definition of what a libertarian is. Did that something that you kind of came up with as you wrote it, or has that been something you've been?
No, it is the way I think about the subject. But yeah, I did craft that. Maybe it's my first time I've ever done that. I attempted to craft a definition for the article, because I really knew this article would be circulated very widely, and in fact, it has been translated to German, French, Portuguese, Spanish, Hebrew, even. So
that's
it's all over the place. Yeah, so I wanted that to be a kind of definition. Also, I didn't so much want it to be my own, but it's something that the liberal tradition generally could embrace. Everybody from David Hume up to today's contemporary libertarians. I wanted a broad enough statement, because I do think we do have a consistent tradition, and yeah, we disagree on a whole range of issues day to day, and there's endless debates about natural rights, what are they, versus consequentialism, blah blah blah. Libertarians disagree all the time, but we are united on the general view that society can manage itself better, on behalf of individuals and communities when left alone by higher authority, when the course of intervention does not disturb our plans and our efforts to discover ever more fuller, more richer, more flourishing ways to live, essentially. And I think that's something that we can all agree with. And really, I don't think libertarianism is claiming any more than that, and that's why I don't think it's good to think of libertarian. Look, I'm an anarchist. Obviously, I'm somewhat of an exotic figure, right? But I don't think that it's right to think about libertarianism as being a stranger or a weird thing that invades the academy, that invades our culture, as the Pope put it. We're not invaders, and we're speaking on behalf of a really beautiful and grand tradition. And this is why it was such a delight to me to dig through Catholic Church history and find all kinds of statements that really beautifully illustrated the principle. I mean, I began with Thomas Aquinas, and he's asked the question, is it the job of the state to suppress vice? And he says, well, it depends. It's a hopeless undertaking to try to suppress every vice that every minority might get involved in, because that won't amount to anything, and it'll cause more harm in the long run. However, those things that most everybody agrees, are generally wrong. Things such as theft and murder and such like, it is the job of the state to suppress. Okay, so in this one statement, St. Thomas basically lays out, a paradigm of classical liberalism. The state should restrain itself to only doing those things that are generally doable and achievable, namely, punishing theft and murder. And he doesn't say the state, says civic authorities. And I think that's right. Now, of course, St. Thomas himself doesn't apply this consistently, because elsewhere in the Summa Theologica, he's asked, is it okay for civic authorities to burn heretics? He said, well, of course. So, we're not talking Murray Rothbard here, but still, I think St. Thomas, that statement from St. Thomas shows that it's not exactly inconsistent with Catholic Church tradition. And then, of course, I just completely delighted in quoting some of the anti-socialist statements of I have to remember now. I think it was Leo the I have to think about this. Leo the 13th, I believe, from the 1870s. That was condemning socialism as a demonic doctrine. And then my favorite statement that I dragged up, and I'm not even sure I had read this. There's a lot of material in Vatican II that has a lot of very good ideas in there. I like many documents from that council, but there's in particular I know as Protestants, you guys are going to be mortified to hear this. I hate to scandalize you, but it wasn't until 1965 really that the Catholic Church finally came to terms with the right to religious freedom. Which, I mean, you hear that and you think, why did it take so long? Well, indeed. But it was a very decisive statement that the church made that every human being has the absolute right to religious freedom and a duty to follow his or her conscience in thought, action, and association. And no one is permitted to coerce anybody against their own will, so long as they're not harming others. Okay? So this is a statement by a church council. This is Dignitatis Humanae. Okay? A beautiful statement on behalf of religious liberty, which, by the way, to this day continues to scandalize Catholic traditionalists because they forever wanting to restore the monarchy and the power of the sword and that sort of thing. But anyway, whether you agree with it or disagree with the statement, I certainly do. I think it was a revolutionary moment in Catholic history. This is a very clear statement, and I have it in my article, and I don't know if you read it, it must have struck you. That's almost a perfect description of kind of purist libertarian doctrine, concerning the rights of the individuals, coming straight out of the Vatican, said with the highest magisterial authority that the church can possibly muster.
And one of the things that you had brought up earlier is this kind of false dichotomy that often happens with the individual and the community. Well, they benefit one another, right? I mean, you can't have community without the individual, and the individuals were created to live in community, and so these things kind of go together. Robert Nisbet in The Quest for Community talked about how the state is kind of an anti-human, anti-community institution. So, I mean, it would seem to me that if the Pope really wants to promote community and the integration of peoples and human flourishing, then he should set his sights against the state and in favor of the market. Would you agree with that?
I absolutely would, and there's a strong basis for this within Catholic history. I mean, the broad stroke of Catholic history in terms of the role of the papacy in European politics, which is a complicated subject with lots of ebbs and flows, but the greatest contribution the papacy ever made to human rights in its history was to be a kind of countervailing power to the claims of princes and the nation state, and I think that's the biggest contribution Catholicism ever made to human rights. I mean, think about it. Catholicism is a universal religion, which necessarily means that what applies to one person applies to the whole of humanity. That if you think that way, you're going to have a very broad mind, towards human rights and human aspirations and human dignity generally. So that's very important because for Catholicism, the rights of the individual do not derive from race, nationhood, language, or even nowadays religious allegiances, but rather belong to everybody by virtue of their dignity they inherit because they're made in the image and likeness of God. So that is a very beautiful assertion to make, and it turns out to have been extremely important in restraining the power of princes throughout European history, and indeed throughout modern history. And in fact, and I think as Protestant libertarians, you have reasons to regret, just as I have many aspects of Catholic history to profoundly regret. But one of the regrettable political fallouts from the Reformation was this loss of universal identity that Christianity had always had up to that point of time. Suddenly, to be a loyal Christian meant to be a good German, or a good member of a certain geographic or racial or linguistic tribe, and that I think is a very unfortunate turn. Now, there are obviously good aspects of the Reformation. I think the assertion of the right of the individual to interpret the Holy Scripture, as his conscience leads him to, or as the Holy Spirit leads him to. These are all good developments. But from a political point of view, the Reformation did unleash a lot of really big dangers on the world that the Catholic Church had, up to that point in history, suppressed, maybe not by intention, but by effect, because of its very universalist outlook, and the fact that the Church, wasn't really running a state in itself, but was rather, served as kind of a countervailing power to the authority of nations and princes. Do you understand what I'm saying? Does that ring a bell with you?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and in fact, we can really take this lesson all the way back to the time of Constantine, right? When the state first started inserting itself into the church with disastrous effect that in some sense we're still living with today. But throughout the Middle Ages, I mean, for our listeners who maybe aren't familiar with the history, like you said, the ecclesiastic authorities were the main competing institution against the all-encompassing power of the state. And really one of the things that we've experienced in modernity, and particularly with the rise of the total state, is all the competing institutions like church and family and business, those all shrink as the state grows. It's the nature of the state is to suppress any competing power center in society that would challenge its authority, and that includes the church. So, I mean, one of the things that's playing out right now that's very relevant to this is what's going on in Venezuela. So we're seeing the total upheaval of where socialism leads, and of course it's happened time and time again throughout history wherever socialism has been tried. I mean, it's untenable. It eventually breaks down into chaos. Whereas,
and I'm glad you're bringing that up, because what kind of effect would the Pope have instead of hanging out in Rome denouncing libertarianism, if he'd take a trip to Venezuela and denounce dictatorship and socialism? I mean, wouldn't that, as John Paul II did in Poland and Cuba and many places around the world? I mean, where's this guy when you need him? I think he could have a very powerful spiritual influence on the future of liberty in Latin America. That just as an aside.
Well, and that's one of the things that you mentioned as far as the church in the 20th century standing against Nazism and communism alike, and playing a pretty significant role in the downfall of those dictatorships. As we consider the trajectory of the world today, what would your advice be to any Christian listening, but also particularly to your fellow Catholics or to Pope Francis? How should the church move forward? Be that, I mean, I'm not just talking about the Catholic Church, but the universal Christian church. How should the church and Christians move forward in our relation to the state in order to start reclaiming the the rich tradition of authentic Christian community that exists outside of state control, if that makes any sense.
Okay, I'm going to give the most obvious answer, but it's the most radical answer. Begin with the words of Christ. That's the very core of what we believe. And it's so easy to get distracted by everything else, but absolutely the most profound teacher in the history of Christianity was Christ himself. And that great, unbelievable moment when he's presented the Roman coin, and he's asked, to whom does this belong? And Jesus makes this tremendously shocking statement in the ancient world, where he just throws down the gauntlet and he says, some things belong to Caesar and some things belong to God. This was the moment. This was the moment where we first began to imagine that there's a city of God and a city of man. When we began to realize that the prince is not the same thing as our final ruler, is not God. The Caesars are not gods on earth. That there's a distinction between the state, the affairs of the state, and the affairs of the spirit. This was an amazing moment, and Jesus lived this throughout his life. I'm just constantly fascinated by his life and how much confusion surrounded him. Many of his followers and during his ministry followed him because they thought he aspired to be an earthly king. And when he came in from the desert after having been tempted by the devil and having gone on such a long fast, he was greeted with palms and celebration. Hosanna, Hosanna. Here's our king has arrived. And then he was crucified. And as he was hanging on the cross, most of his followers by now thought, well, I guess we bet on the wrong horse. We wanted him to be our king, but clearly he's been defeated. So let's forget about him. And his followers dwindled down to a precious few. But then 3 days later rises from the dead and then appears before his apostles. Jesus lives again, not as a king of this earth, but as the Rex Celestis, the King of Heaven. That's where our hearts are. That's what should drive our conscience. That's where our loyalties ultimately reside, not in this world, but in the transcendent realm, where you can find final truth. So that's why I think ultimately, if you want to talk about a Christian libertarianism, that's the core of its conviction, that our hearts are animated by and infused by a sense of the spiritual realm as being our final authority, not the authority of princes, not kings, not presidents, not democracy or any other political system that you want. And I think from that, you can derive a conviction and a firm belief in human freedom as the right, true, and moral system we should have on earth to prepare for the afterlife.
Well, I don't know if there's any better way to wrap up this show than to conclude on those words. Jeffrey, thank you very much for being with us for this episode of the Libertarian Christian Podcast.
Listen, I don't get a chance to talk about this stuff very much, so I can't thank you enough. I really appreciate it.
Well, believe us, you're welcome back here anytime. I mean, this was quite a great moment for us to be able to have you on. You're really one of the leading thinkers in the overall liberty movement and certainly the libertarian Christian movement. So, we're tremendously blessed to have had you here with us today.
Let's hang out again sometime and talk about the parables of Christ, because I think you can pretty much find out everything you need to know about economics and liberty from those. So let's do it again.
That sounds great. That's all the time we have today on the Libertarian Christian Podcast. If you'd like to reach out to us, you can email podcast@libertarianchristians.com or use the contact form on libertarianchristians.com. libertarianchristians.com. You can also support us by going to libertarianchristians.com/donate. Thank you for joining us, and we'll talk to you next time.
The Libertarian Christian Podcast is a project of the Libertarian Christian Institute, a registered 501c3 nonprofit. The audio engineers were Doug Stewart and Jason Rink, and voiceovers were by Matthew Bellis and Caitlin Horn. If you'd like to find out more about the LCI, please visit us on the web at www.libertarianchristians.com.